So just to refresh your memories, after Dr. Kellogg's presentation, we have a 20-minute break, which has become a 10-minute break. So during that 10-minute break, please visit the exhibitors and talk amongst yourselves. We also have plenty of time at the end of the day for networking and socializing, etc. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce another member of the Executive Committee of the Division on Addictions and really one of the true thought leaders in our profession, Dr. Scott Kellogg.
So good morning. Am I on? Can you hear me? You can hear me, but I can't hear me. Okay. Good morning. So I'm also this year's president of the Division on Addictions of the New York State Psychological Association. But I just want to acknowledge that I'm really I'm kind of the last person in a relay race here, and I want to really acknowledge my predecessors who really did so much to create this conference today. First, Dr. Alexandra Woods, who's sitting over there. Maybe you can wave your hand for us. Thank you. And Dr. Andrew Tatarsky, who did the bulk of the work to bring this conference to fruition. And really the executive committee, a number of members will present today, and you've certainly seen them in action throughout the morning. But really just an extraordinary, hardworking, creative group of people, and it's really, I'm very fortunate to be able to work with them. I think we're all very fortunate to be able to work with each other. So I just want to acknowledge the executive committee for being so extraordinary. Let's see now. We're talking about complexity, and I was trying to talk about complexity in ways that were more simplistic, but my slides ended up being complex. So I'm handing out copies. Did you get copies of my slides? So if I didn't, so I made 100 copies thinking I'd be overly optimistic, but I might, if I fell short, maybe you can share with your neighbor, as they used to say in the old days. So I'm going to talk for a little bit, not too long. And then I was thinking that maybe we could talk about some cases, or if you have, maybe you could think about a patient that you're wrestling with, or dancing with the other metaphors Andrew used. And see if any of these ideas are applicable to the kind of situations that you're working with. I was thinking, what do I talk about in terms of the internal world of patients? And I guess we always go back to tell your own story. So these are the issues that strike me. These are the forces of therapy that strike me and really guide my work. I just want to acknowledge that some of my students are here from NYU. I want to acknowledge them, and I'm very glad to see as they showed up today. So. Certain themes I think will keep emerging throughout the day, because I think many of us drink from the same well. And again, also drawing from Dr. Kantian, who said the heart of addictive disorders is suffering. And I also agree that we're talking about pain when we're talking about addiction. And speaking of language, there's been a lot of some of the listeners that Andrew and I and others are on, this issue about addict not being a word that's proper to use. And to some degree, I think we're moving away from calling people their diagnosis. And I will resonate with that, has some truth. I have to watch myself, my own language. But I do think the word addiction is a very good word, because I think the word addiction, well, first of all, I think despite, after a lifetime working in this field, it feels like, I think people still trivialize addictions. And they trivialize the whole experience of having problems with drugs and alcohol, despite millions and billions of dollars being spent. And the word addiction connects to the idea of slavery in its origins. And I think we need to see addictions as very profound experiences that are incredibly tragic, both to people who have them and to people who love them. And they bring oceans of pain and suffering to the world. And so I like the word addiction, even if I will cease using the word addict to discuss patients. So at the heart of addiction, I think there are two phenomena. One is self-hatred, and the other is trauma. And I think people either have one or the other or both. I think this is at the center of every patient I see. I constantly come up with this. So what are my goals for the people I work with? And I have two fundamental goals. One is I want to increase their internal freedom, and also want to increase their personal complexity. And I believe that these two goals are appropriate because these two goals are the anathema of being addicted to something. Because addiction shrinks your internal world, and it blocks or crushes your personal complexity. I remember early on in my career, I worked in a methadone clinic at the Lower East Side Harm Reduction, Lower East Side Service Center in the 1980s. And I remember this was a very sort of street-driven methadone clinic at the time. And I remember thinking, my patients are, I'm going to say the word addict, contradicting myself, but they have an addict identity 24 hours a day. They're never anything but an addicted person. And in fact, the only person they ever speak to who's not addicted is their mother. And the whole sense of self has completely collapsed into one identity. Right? And that was very striking to me. And this idea of identity and transformation has been an ongoing theme of my work. My work is fundamentally centered on ideas of multiplicity of self. And I would think if after this talk, if you take nothing away from what I've said, my hope would be that you would begin to look at your patients in terms of multiplicity of self, of having different parts, different energies, different identities, different modes or selves, and seeing them in this way, and seeing that it's one part of them that uses substances. It's not the totality of the self. So certainly multiplicity of self is this long-standing idea in our field. We go back to Freud, we have id-ego, superego, of course. And I think we have a major revolution with Eric Berne, with transactional analysis. Burns, I understand, was inspired by Ferdinand, a psychoanalyst, but really goes from ego and superego to parent, adult, child. And in this reworking of the self, he really opens up for a much more relational vision of the internal world of the human being. My own intersection with this really comes from schema mode therapy, the work of Jeffrey Young, who I think really built on the work of the transactional analysis and kind of developed it further in his schema mode model. Now I want to introduce some of these ideas, and I'm using not the technical language that schema mode therapists would use so much, but more of a functional language so that you will understand what he's driving at. Before I get that, I should say, the basic idea here is that the internal world of patients can be conceived of as containing different parts or cells or modes or identities, and some of these parts or modes play a role in suffering and play a role in the substance use. But also some of these parts can be used for healing and recovery. And that therapy becomes a whole inner rebalancing or inner restructuring of the self. And that's what this project that we're engaging in with our patients is all about. So from schema mode therapy. So again, we have what is typically called the healthy adult mode. I also could call the heroic self. Essentially somewhat equivalent to the ego, although I think the energy is slightly different in the terminology. We start there. And then there's a part of the patient that contains the trauma, contains the fear, the anxiety, all the suffering of the patient is in another part. We would actually think of that as a child. And there's an inner critic, or a part that hates the self and attacks the self. Dr. Tatarsky mentioned this before. Patient I saw recently, I said, there's a new patient, I said, so, I'm interested, do you have a part of you that criticizes you? He said, oh, you mean the part that drives my drug use? Yeah, that part. I'd like to talk to that part, if I may. Some people have an impulsive or angry mode. We see this in the more borderline spectrum patients, of course. And then how do people cope with these things? Well, problematically start coping with self-stimulating coping mode. Cocaine, methamphetamine, sex, all kinds of things that rev up the system, that take us away from our experience of self, the pain within. Or self-soothing coping mechanisms, marijuana, opiates, calming ourselves down. Some people choose one, some people choose the other, some people choose both. And that becomes the problematic way of dealing with inner pain. And then I do believe that Nida's work on neuroscience, while I think they overplay the card, or overplay their hand, is definitely important. And I kind of think of a mode of the self as the brain. The brain wants the drugs to some degree. The limbic system wants to repeat those experiences. So I think that's a part of the self as well. Joe Lobestal, who's a Dutch schema therapist, wrote, the goal of therapy is to strengthen the healthy sides of patients. And therapists help patients to flip from dysfunctionality to healthy modes. So again, arguing for a restructuring of the self. So I think of the tasks of the healthy adult mode, the task of the heroic self, some would be the tasks of the ego, to use a different language. One would be affect regulation. Can we bring the trauma, can we bring the fear under control to some degree? Can we mitigate the attacks of the inner critic? Can we rein in impulsive behaviors or angry behaviors? Can we reduce the reliance on problematic coping modes? Assertiveness is a central part of what I do. I see this as the development of the voice of respectful desire. And can the patient engage with the world in ways that are purposeful and meaningful and effective in some ways? So the heroic self. I think when our patients come into treatment, what we find is they typically have very weak, healthy adult modes. I think their egos are quite stressed, not very functional. And maybe have never been very functional for that matter. Or maybe they were, but they have been battered down. And I see patients walking really with various combinations of inner critic attack. They feel like they are terrible, terrible people. The self-esteem, the self-concepts of addicted individuals are often horrendous. They're facing difficult external situations. The harm reductionists constantly remind us about the role of social oppression, right? More true for some than others. They have no future orientation. Nancy Petrie's research on this issue. They live in the now in a very unproductive way, not in the enlightened Eckhart Tolle way, but the kind of like I can only live in this moment, way, filled with anxiety and internal suffering, and filled with trauma and loss, and also maybe physical pain or brain dysregulation as well, which drives them, of course, to self-soothing or self-stimulating drug use to cope and to manage this. I think certainly during and after treatment, we want to see a strengthening of this healthy adult mode. And while there have been some papers about the importance of ego development in treatment, I think at least I have not heard people discuss that the fundamental work of addiction therapy is to increase strengthen the self. I don't see people talking about that. This is why we are here, is to strengthen the ego, to strengthen the healthy adult, to really nurture the heroic self. I don't hear people talking this way. But to me, I think this is essentially the task we're faced with. So that in terms of substance use, they can reduce harm. They can take action to control their drug use. They can resist the pressure of outside forces or peers. And they can make self-directed choices about their lives and about their substance use. In addition, they can begin to claim the future, right? We can measure recovery by the sense of future that people have. They can face their fears, confront their self-hatred, and take action in their lives. I'm very influenced by Kristen Neff in the work of self-compassion. I work with patients trying to develop a mode of self-compassion. I think it's extremely difficult. I think it's extremely difficult for therapists to develop self-compassion, let alone patients. But I think this is the new frontier for us, is self-compassion. This is the new challenge to all of us to begin to be able to speak to ourselves this way. I think Christopher Gorman says to speak to yourself as if you were a friend. It sounds so simple, but so difficult. As some of you may know, I'm profoundly influenced by Fritz Perls and the use of Gestalt chair work. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But other idea of Fritz Perls that to me is essential is his emphasis on language. And he constantly monitors the language of his patients, and he constantly challenges the language of his patients. And what I call existential language, which is really the language of the heroic self, is to have patients speak from things like I want, I'm deciding to, I am choosing to, I will or I will not do something, rather than saying things like I need to, I must, I should, or I can't. Right? These are all language that disavows responsibility. Right? But we want to seek to empower the individual. So all of these ideas, which I think are fascinating but perhaps a bit abstract, come to play in the decisional balance. And as I often say, decisional balance is at the heart of addiction psychotherapy. The positives of drug use. Such a great question to ask patients. How do drugs work for you? Right? Really opening up a conversation that many people feel like they cannot have. What are the joys? What are the benefits? What are the negatives of your drug use? What are the positives of change as you perceive it, whatever that change might be? Another great question. What are the negatives? What are the costs of giving up these substances? What are the costs of changing this behavior? Right? And by the way, that fourth quadrant is often where the relapse will come from. Right? That often can tell us, give us a hint where problems are going to come. I think I would have a free-flowing microphone I could actually move, but we'll see what happens. But I have my two chairs there, right? So in one chair, if you can see my two chairs up here in front, I can anchor these two parts of the self in these two chairs. In one chair, perhaps to my right and your, I guess your stage left there. I love the drugs. I want the drugs. They help me feel good. They take away my pain. They take away my suffering. I don't want to give them up. And the other chair, I am frightened. I am scared. Bad things are happening. I'm going to lose my life. I'm losing my future. I want something different. Right? And giving a space for both parts of the self to really speak clearly and speak forcefully. I like this drawing. This is actually a drawing by Freud. Here's a good hand, yes? Somebody pointed out that in Freud's drawing of his psychic system, it bears a striking resemblance to the brain. I think he wanted a neuroscience. I don't think you know that. He wanted a neurobiological basis for his model. I think our traditional treatments were what I would call superego-based treatments. And I think AA and the therapeutic communities had a very strong superego component to them. And you see patients who have internalized this. I think commonly when they come into treatment saying that I should do this, I should stop using this. But the psychological approaches, and I think Alan Marlatt brought us there first, really are what I call ego-based change, which is basically I want. Right? And I want to work with, as Pearl said before, I want to move patients from I should to I want. Because patients heal and recover by strengthening the part that wants to change, not by persuading the part that wants to use to desire recovery. It is a bad day in the therapeutic office when you're arguing with a patient about their drug use, right? That is a waste of time. Or arguing about anything, about cutting or whatever they're doing. You want the part of them that's unhappy to argue with that, right? I always say, who is unhappy in you? If nobody's unhappy, it's not a therapeutic issue, basically, right? But somebody's unhappy or you wouldn't be in this room. Who's unhappy? I want that person to speak. I want the dialogue between the two parts of the self. I don't want to be arguing with them. But I want the desire to use to engage with the desire to change. Right? These are ego kind of conversations. So looking a little more specifically at some of the experiences we have with patients. I think another theme you'll see throughout the day is this central emphasis on the therapeutic relationship. And for me, of course, this is the foundation of mode restructuring. This is the foundation of changing the internal world. I think it's obviously necessary. I don't think it's sufficient in many cases to bring healing, but certainly we get nowhere without a strong therapeutic alliance. Dr. Tatarsky and I have written about the horizontal and the vertical interventions. Actually, I later discovered that Wormser actually talked about it before we did. But the horizontal ones are those which I think of as focused on controlling or discontinuing drug use. Just to look at a few of them within the context of this framework. Harm reduction. So one way I think of harm reduction is really as a series of micro-encounters between a self-directed adult self and a pain-driven addicted self, or coping mode if you want to look at it another way. And that while the harm reduction people, I think, first of all, I believe harm reduction saves lives and is vitally important. There's a major emphasis on harm reduction in harm reduction about education, about paraphernalia, and about sort of technical matters. And I think all of this stuff is very important. But I think for people to really engage in harm reduction or really to engage in moderation, they need to at some point claim an identity as a harm reduction practitioner or as a moderation person. Because that's how you do it repeatedly. I am a person who practices harm reduction. I don't share needles with other people, or I inject in certain ways, or I only, do intranasal. I don't do intravenous use. I claim this identity for myself. I don't know that we necessarily think of harm reduction in terms of its psychological identity component, but I think that is the future. I have patients, virtually all my patients are there for moderation, and sit in a chair and say, I am a moderate drinker. How does it feel to say that? For some, it feels very uncomfortable. It feels very strange to say that, right? Versus, I'm using addictively. I'm using any way I want to at any moment, right? And contrasting these two aspects of self. But I think we can begin to see harm reduction as an identity project, to use Herole's term. Relapse prevention. So to my mind, relapse prevention is the foundation of the psychological revolution in addiction treatment. And the late Dr. Alan Marlatt, the greatest giant really in our field. But this is the quintessential self-empowerment therapy. And it's centrally focused on strengthening the healthy adult mode. It's all about choosing, deciding, having a voice, taking action, making a plan, understanding the complexity of things, right? This whole treatment is based on this model, strengthening the ego, strengthening the heroic self. Contingency management. I love contingency management. I love positive reinforcements. I use it constantly. So what do I do in private practice? I offer this to my patients. I say, let us make a goal this week for moderation. If you achieve your goal, I will take $10 off of your fee. If you don't achieve the goal, I will charge you $25 more. Do you want to play? And they say, yes, I want to play. And the results I get are simply astounding. And I tell my colleagues about this, and they all laugh, just like you laugh. And then they all ignore me. And I don't know anybody on planet Earth who does this but me. And I get unbelievable results week after week after week. And I tell people this, and they think, Scott, he's a character. But, I don't know. I don't know how to persuade the world that this is a very important thing to do. And I get unbelievable results. And recently, a man came to see me. He'd been sober for 4 days. He'd not been sober for 4 days probably since he was 15. And reinforcement's central, not the only thing, but central to this project. He said, I never thought I would do this. So, reinforcements, which work on many levels, not just Skinnerian levels of substitute reinforcements. Actually, Dr. Tversky said about if the quote about if addiction is not more attractive than drug use, why would you choose? I'm sorry, if recovery is not more attractive than drug use, why would you choose it? It's actually from Alan Marlatt, or he said something similar at least, where he said we have to make treatment a competing reinforcement to drug use. And he supported the use of reinforcements. But another level of positive reinforcement strengthen the healthy adult mode. This is this new part of the self that we're trying to grow and nurture in some way. And it's very hard to, it's very hard to be in recovery. You give up all kinds of pleasures and reinforcements. You give up a whole world. But yet, here with this, giving them some money, it's very exciting. It's a symbol. It's an interpersonal event. People love money, I've discovered. And by the way, they have the option to turn this down. It's not enforced on them. And then when they lose, they have to pay extra money. They hate that. And it inspires them to work even harder. So, but anyway, it strengthens the adult self. It's really a fantastic intervention. And mindfulness, Jen Talley over there. Want to raise your hand, Jen, so we can see you? Thank you. Mindfulness is another, I think, intervention to help the healthy adult mode, because it gives the healthy adult part of the self, the adult mode, a way to be with cravings, to be with internal pain and suffering as a witness, to witness and to breathe and to stand. Right? So we have a skill where we don't have to act, we can just be there, and gives us something to do. And that is deeply strengthening, I think, as well, to the adult self. Andrew and I have also talked about the vertical interventions as those to deal with the underlying suffering or psychopathology, the pain, the darkness that drives the substance use, that drives the addiction. And Dirk Moreno pointed out that patients either typically are suffering from the past, suffering from the present, or suffering from the future, or suffering from various combinations of the three. And I think there's truth to that. So patients come in with grief and loss. And I've come to realize that grief, not always, but grief also is really trauma, which I was not quite so aware of, I think, when I first began this work. But grief work brings internal freedom, putting down the burden of sorrow. And here now using chairs, right? You have the patient can speak to the person who's missing, the person who's deceased, the person who's gone in some way. Have a dialogue to say what wasn't said. And one nice thing about chair work is that grief work can work very rapidly. Even in one session, you can make a huge amount of progress with a grief dialogue. Interpersonal trauma. Whether you use imagery or you use chair work or other ways, trauma reenactments allow the patient to go through childhood trauma, traumas before, but this time as a healthy adult, not as a child again. So here, the patient and the therapist, we can both speak to the abusers, and we can protect the child, we can nurture the child. Right? So this kind of replaying of these horrendous situations, the patient can now claim power. Very profound, very difficult work, but very profound. Claiming the present. To my mind, the inner critic is where we see the present perhaps most. But working with the inner critic in our dialogues, engaging with the inner critic in various ways, we can weaken its power, and we can fundamentally serve to move the moral center of the individual to the heroic self. I think when we look at the great people of history, we look at the Nelson Mandelas, and we look at the Martin Luther Kings, and people like that, we see men and women who have really done the deep ethical work, and they've gone inside themselves. They've really looked at what their values are. This is the kind of work that I think most of us are afraid to do. But they go in there and they look at these things and they say, I will claim my powers, and I will claim my values, and I will claim my morals. And they work from the ego and not from the superego. When you work from the superego, you're serving somebody else. But when you work from you live from your ego, you're claiming it because you believe it's true. Right? And we all, obviously it's a dance, but I think there's something to that. This is what I think is right, and this is what I think is wrong. And that's the kind of engagement we need with the inner critic. So here often I think one part is that as a therapist, I need to speak to the patient's inner critic. I say, can you be your inner critic? Let me talk to that inner critic. Most patients can't do it very well to begin with. They either believe the inner critic or they're so cowed by it. It's hard for them to engage with the critical part. But I can be the advocate. I can be the lawyer for the defense. That's what one of my colleagues calls it. And I can take on the inner critic. I can defend the patient. Paul Chadwick, who works with severely mentally ill patients, argues that many of these patients have dreadful self-concepts. They feel they're just horrendously terrible people, chronic mentally ill. They have no sense of their goodness. So basically they're being bombarded by an inner critic voice. But here we can create a series of dialogues where they say, I am bad, but also I am good. And they go from self as bad to self as bad and self as good. And that kind of inner complexity also I think is profoundly healing. And as you know, many patients with addictions feel they're just terrible, terrible people. They have terrible self-concepts. And then going to anxiety. I was talking to Jamie Wolf before about working with prolonged exposure. But exposure therapy is a therapy that involves courage. It's a heroic thing to close your eyes and to go into those traumas. Right? If you've seen those tapes, you know how painful that is, how frightening that is. So doing exposure therapies of various kinds, or doing in vivo exposure therapies, I remember I worked in a study, we had people would drive by the house where they were sexually abused in Connecticut. We did these studies. Very difficult. The hearts would be beating. That fosters courage, and that also increases their personal freedom. That helps to develop the heroic self. And finally, I think all people who are addicted are challenged with creating the future. And the first step, I think, is assertiveness. Assertiveness was popular in the 1970s, but to my mind, it's never gone away. And it's a central part of my work, certainly, in helping patients create their voice of respectful desire, which I think is a core attribute of the heroic self. And I see assertiveness as a kind of a bridge between the present and the future. This is what I want. This is what I'm saying. This is what I believe in. I will speak to you as an equal. I will speak to you with respect. I will stand my ground. And then lastly, what I call heroic existentialism. So I think here are three of the great giants of that. Dr. William James, actually the co-founder of the American Psychological Association. President Theodore Roosevelt, not only a president, but a great philosopher and a great man of action. And Dr. Albert Schweitzer, another philosopher and also another man of action. Dr. Ernest Becker, who wrote The Denial of Death, said, we like to be reminded that our central calling, our main task on this planet, is the heroic. And I think many people who really achieve successful recoveries, successful moderation, who make these major transformations out of an experience of addiction, take on projects of heroic existentialism. That there's an injustice to be remedied and corrected, or suffering to be healed and relieved, or something of beauty to be protected and preserved, or someone or something that is loved to be nurtured and developed. And I believe that this is fundamentally the defining work of the heroic self. And to me, it's always exciting to go to addiction conferences because everybody I see, they're all heroic existentialists. They're all on a project to save somebody or do something or create something or say, no, this is wrong. The war on drugs is wrong and I'm fighting it. Or those women who've been abused, I want to help them, or I'm helping another addict, so I've been through that journey. I mean, it's just all over the place, right? It's one of the great things about this conference. So probably a bunch of heroic existentialists out there right now. Hey, I see some smiling as I'm talking. So with that, I think I'll stop. I think we have do I have a few minutes or? Okay. So yeah, if people want to ask a question, or if you have a case you want to talk about, maybe we can do something. Nobody has any difficult patients. That's really good. Oh, I think there's a microphone here, actually, if you want to. It's supposed to work. Where's the AV guy? Where's the AV guy?
Hello?
It works. All right.
Hi.
Hi.
Adrian Glasser.
Hi, yes.
Hi, yes. It's good to see you again. Thank you for the presentation. I just wanted to ask how you handle in the chair work if somebody doesn't have access to the heroic self or an adult sense of self, how you work with that in the chair work.
Well, I don't know if everybody who just has no adult self, because I mean to have no ego whatsoever. But
limited.
Maybe limited. So I would coach them through it. So I say, try this, say this. I want. I think. Actually, I have a little script I have people read out loud. I say yes to this, and I say no to that. I want this. I don't want that. I will do this. I'm making this decision. This is my intention. I can say these words. They get a feeling for what that sounds like. But then you think of a specific situation that's the problem. Then you can anchor it more in a specific aspect of the life. Is there one you're thinking of in particular, or?
No, that was really helpful. Just to go back to that language.
Right. So I do a lot of what they call feeding them words. Feeding them. Then try this. See what this feels like to say. Oh wow, that feels. And it's interesting. What's the reaction, right? It's interesting. There was some early work done on assertiveness training with women in the 1970s, and the original view was that women, like other people, women like men, I guess, were not assertive because they didn't have the skills. That it was a skill issue. For many men, didn't know how to be assertive. But with women, they also found they had many thoughts that it might not be safe for me to do this, or might not be okay for me to do this. So it wasn't just a technical skill of not knowing assertiveness language, but what gets triggered in you. So I think that's very interesting when you do that with them. See, well, how does it feel to say that? Why does it feel awkward? What's the schema that's getting? Is there a schema that we need to address? Is it okay to have a voice in this world? Right. So it can be, in one way, straightforward, but it'll be very complex and very deep, and all kinds of stuff emerges. So.
I'm glad that didn't stop me to ask a question.
You're very good. So for you, it's only a technical issue, not a cultural issue.
So thank you, Scott. I want to remind everybody that we have 2 more presentations this morning, after which we're going to have a 25-minute period for questions and answers that'll be directed to all of the morning presenters. So there'll be plenty of time for Q&A later on. I'd like to thank Scott for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
Also, thanks to Scott for being president of the division and being the person who spearheaded this conference for us yet again. For many years, Scott and Andrew just ping-ponged back and forth as president of the division. But this year, or for next year, Rebecca Block is our incoming president, and you're going to get to hear her speak after the